Good morning, everyone. My name is Bryce Johnson, and I'm the inclusive lead for Microsoft Devices. I work on our hardware accessibility here at Microsoft. And if you're in the US and you're able to vote, I hope you have voted today. It's very important. But today we're going to be talking about our inclusive design practice at Microsoft and how we used it to develop the Xbox Adaptive Controller. In this presentation, Recognize Exclusion, Design for Inclusion. So the thing that we have to realize as makers of products is that there are over 1 billion people in the world who have a disability. It's somewhere between 15 and 20%. It depends on how you tend to look at it. And what we believe at Microsoft is that their exclusion harms us all. And so our mission at Microsoft is to empower every person in every organization on the planet to achieve more. And when we don't intentionally include people with disabilities in the things that we create, we're actively working against our mission. Every person is literal. We are trying to empower everyone. The way that we look at disability was really influenced in 2014 by how the World Health Organization redefined their definition of disability. They changed it from a personal health condition to a mismatch in human interactions between a person and their environment. So what does that mean? It means that if you're an individual who uses a wheelchair and you go into a building and you need to get to the second floor, and the only way to get to the second floor is a set of stairs, it's not your fault. It's not your wheelchair's fault. It's the designer of the building's fault, because they created a mismatch in human interactions that actually causes a barrier for you. And there's lots of examples that we have throughout this, but that's a very extreme one. But it's this interesting idea that disability is designed by people who make products. Now, that's what they call the social model of disability. It's not the only model of disability. There's other models of disability that are important to many people, like the identity model of disability. But the social model of disability is something that's really useful for product makers. So you may have seen this little Super Bowl ad. I'm going to play it. This is for the adaptive controller. This was the Microsoft ad for the Super Bowl in 2019.
Hey, Bryce, we can't hear the volume of the video.
Okay, I'm gonna have to stop. Let's wonder if I can. Sorry about that, folks. Where did that? Huh. There we go. Include computer audio.
My name is Grover. Sean. My name is.
Can people hear it now?
Yes, we're good.
Okay, great. Thanks for letting me know.
My name is Grover. Sean. My name is Ian. I'm Taylor. My name is Owen, and I am 9.5 years old. I only have one. And yeah. I love video games, my friends, my family, and again video games. Whenever I play it, it makes me feel happy.
The fun that you get to have with connecting with your friends.
Do you make your own rules?
It's his way of interacting with his friends when he can't physically otherwise do it.
When I'm playing with a regular controller, there's some things that don't work for me. It's difficult for me to use both joysticks and the D-pad at the exact same time.
And it just slowed me down a bunch more, while other people were like...
She's never had the freedom to play at the level she knows she could.
I never thought it was unfair. I just thought, hey, this is the way it is and it's not going to change. What I like about the adaptive controller is that now everyone can play. I don't even have to look at the controller and just be like looking at the screen like, hey, yep.
You never want your kid to feel like an outsider or an other.
One of the biggest fears early on is, how will Owen be viewed by the other kids? He's not different when he plays.
It's a little challenging, but that's the whole point of gaming. I can hit the buttons just as fast as they can. And I think I can crush my friends. No matter how your body is or how fast you are, you can play. It's a really good thing to have in this world.
So yeah, that was our Super Bowl ad.
My name
Let's kind of skip that, this next thing. When the Super Bowl ad came out, this tweet came from Dear Miss Hashim. She's a first grade teacher. She said, today we watched and rewatched and reflected on this Microsoft commercial with first grade, and here are some of their thoughts. Some kids cannot change. It doesn't mean they can't play. Microsoft did not want the kids to change, so they changed the remote. Yep, that's what we did. That's pretty much the whole project in a nutshell, to be honest. And it's great that people, you know, recognize that. I will say though, unlike, I think when you look at the story through the lens of the commercial and a bunch of other things, it might give you an impression that we started with children, but we absolutely did not. We actually started this journey working with veterans. And this article is a few days old, but it's a really great one from Wired. And there's some really good quotes in here that I can tell you really did. This is where we started from. In this one here, 18.5% of service members returning from conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan met criteria for either depression or post-traumatic stress, and were more likely to commit suicide than the general population. This is another quote from this article from Ken Jones, who is the founder of Warfighter Engaged, which is the charity we actually started with when we started creating the adaptive controller. And Ken says, once those disabled veterans were able to get back into gaming, they'd come back with positive attitudes towards therapy. Playing video games was a major plus for them. So many people are alive today because of these technologies. Many would have committed suicide otherwise. And we heard that from people, from veterans that we talked to. Here are two veterans that we talked to. This is Todd and Josh. Josh, there is in the red shirt. He was the guy that basically started this whole thing. He showed us this rig that Ken had made for him from Warfighter Engaged. You can see that he's limb different. So he uses a joystick under his arm, and then he has a button array in front of him. He's also a wheelchair user, but that's how he's set up. And then Todd is a quad amputee, and he basically uses all of his limbs in different forms to be able to play games. So the thing about the adaptive controller that, you know, that is important to kind of recognize is that we created the adaptive controller for gamers with limited mobility, but we were inspired to support the mental health of the veterans that we partnered with. And that's, you know, something that I can look back on like a couple years later and go, oh, okay, that's what we, because that is what we were doing. It's just, it's nice to kind of say it out loud. So when we develop products, we use this framework called the Microsoft Inclusive Design Methods to help us frame and present the ideas. And they basically start from these three principles: recognize exclusion, learn from diversity, and solve for one, extend to many. And I'm going to get into them in more detail right now. So let's start with recognize exclusion. Exclusion happens when we solve problems using our own biases. As Microsoft designers, we seek out those exclusions and use them as opportunities to create new ideas and inclusive designs. So the thing that we had to recognize for us really early on when we started taking accessibility seriously in Xbox and our devices was that our beloved controller was actually causing mismatches and interactions for people. This is the 8th generation controller. If you're into gaming, Generation 9 comes out in 8 days. So Generation 9 is Xbox is coming out in 8 days. And the controller's, you know, largely unchanged, but it's very optimized over many sort of generations of gaming consoles, because we keep adding more buttons that you hit with basically 4 fingers holding them like 3 inches apart. And so the thing that we had to recognize is that we assume that people use 2 hands to operate it, and they have 2 thumbs to use those thumbsticks. And we also assume that people have the fine motor control to hit all the buttons. And sometimes game designers assume that people can hit the buttons simultaneously. We assume that people have the ability to reach around and grab the bumpers and triggers, you know. We assume that people have the endurance and strength to be able to hold it for an extended period of time. And for us, we had to recognize that if you couldn't do any of those things, we were creating a barrier for you to video games. Like, if you couldn't use this as we designed it, you know, this was the problem. We had to recognize that we were excluding. So let's go into this next principle, learn from diversity. Human beings are the real experts in adapting to diversity. Inclusive design puts people in the center from the very start of the process, and those fresh, diverse perspectives are the key to true insight. This principle is basically founded upon this idea in the disability community called nothing about us without us. We don't design for people with disabilities. We strive to design with people with disabilities. They are our stakeholders. They are our partners. We do this with them, not for them. And that's a very kind of important distinction that we really try hard to meet. And for the adaptive controller, we partnered with 5 charities. We started with Warfighter Engaged. We worked with Able Gamers in the US, the Cerebral Palsy Foundation in the US, Special Effect, which is a charity in the UK. All these photos are from Special Effect. So these are gamers that Special Effect helps. And we partnered with Craig Hospital, which is a spinal cord and brain injury hospital in Denver. All of these partners had similar goals, but they all had different approaches of how they kind of approached the problem of adapting gaming for people. And so their insight was invaluable to us as we created the adaptive controller, because we had to create something that worked for all of them and in their practices. So to give you like 3 sort of distinct examples, you saw the rigs from Warfighter Engaged, Todd and Josh. Ken builds those from scratch. He builds everything basically, you know, from the ground up, and then he gives them, they're tailor-made for the people that he works with. Able Gamers, because they're a charity, actually I'm just go to Special Effect. Special Effect, because they're a charity in the UK, they can take an occupational therapist and a technician, they can put a bunch of things in a car and they can drive to your house, because you can pretty much drive around the UK. You can't drive around the US. So Able Gamers, they have a grant program where you basically submit a grant and Able Gamers will try to give you a set of equipment that you can use to kind of get going. So it's varying degrees of customizability. Able Gamers does a lot of volume, and Able Gamers tends to have to kind of ship out things and consult remotely. So it's a lot more off-the-shelf products with Able Gamers. Special Effect has their own kind of process down. It's still a lot more off-the-shelf than Warfighter. Warfighter is very, very custom. And so we had to create a device that met the needs of all these folks. And beyond their needs, one of the things that we had to recognize was, while there's not a lot in these pictures, there are some, you know, you have to recognize that there are people in the lives of people with disabilities. They're caregivers. And we weren't just creating a device for people with disabilities. I mean, they were our primary customer for sure. But we also had to take into account the needs of caregivers, because they're the ones that are likely going to be setting this, or building a rig and adjusting a rig for someone. So it's important to think about them. This last principle we have, solve for one, extend to many. Everyone has abilities and limits to those abilities. Designing for people with permanent disabilities actually results in designs that benefit people universally. Constraints are a beautiful thing. So we talk about this a lot in the sense that when you design for someone who has a permanent disability, you can gain benefit for people who might have a temporary limitation or a situational disability. This is what we at Microsoft call the persona spectrum. And with the persona spectrum, here's an example. Basically, if you have designed something for someone who has one hand, you've designed something for someone who has maybe a broken arm. That's a temporary limitation. and you've designed something for someone who has a situational limitation of one-handedness. Let's say they're holding a baby, right? All of these things, you know, kind of combine, and it helps us to create more benefit for people by focusing on the needs of people with disabilities. So here's an example. This is our friend Jesse. Jesse is what they would call, Jesse's a quadriplegic. He's what they would call a high quadriplegic. So he does not have movement below his neck. He can't move his hands at all, his arms. So we're setting him up here with like a mouth joystick that plugs into the adaptive controller. And he's going to use that mouth joystick to move the person around, and it's got a sip and puff tube. So if you blow into that tube, it's an action. If you suck on the tube, it's a separate action. So he's basically got a joystick with 2 buttons right there. And we're going to try to get him, we set him up here to play some games. Actually, I think we had him playing Halo with this, which, you know, is really interesting. And Jesse's really good at it. He's always been very helpful. But this is one extreme that we looked at. This is our friend Cherry. They have a condition that makes it hard for them to press the buttons that are on the joystick. So what a lot of people, you may or may not know, these joysticks are also buttons. They're called stick presses. And for people with decreased strength, it's really difficult for them to use them as joysticks and as buttons. So what Cherry does is they use a feature that we have on the system called Copilot. And what Copilot does is it basically says 2 controllers, like these 2 controllers are merged and they act as 1 controller. So the Xbox thinks that 2 controllers are actually 1 controller. And so Cherry will remap the 2 big buttons on the adaptive controller to those stick presses so that she can just let gravity basically do the job, use different parts of their body to be able to press those buttons. And so these are 2 examples of many that we looked at kind of individually around all kinds of spectrums of permanent disability that we use to basically frame how we thought about the design of the device. So to kind of put it in a different perspective, for recognized exclusion, we had to recognize that our traditional game controller was optimized around a primary use case that made assumptions, and that when someone couldn't use the controller, it was the controller's fault. It was the barrier. So for Learn from Diversity, we engaged across the gaming accessibility community, and we gained insight not only into the function of the device, but the form. So what does that mean? It means that we were very aware that we didn't want to create a device that stigmatized people who used it. So if you think about a lot of medical devices, they basically other you. Like if you're wearing, if you have to use a medical device, it can be very stigmatizing. It can other you. I am old enough to remember when I was a little kid, you'd get fun of for wearing glasses, right? You get made fun of, and now that stigma is, almost non-existent. Everyone wears glasses. Glasses are a fashion accessory. Glasses are something that is part of what we use to express ourselves. But glasses are also an assistive technology. They help us see. So that's what we're striving for in our design practice, is to unstigmatize this tech. And so solve for one, extend to many. We looked across many cases of people's mobility. I got to take that word ambulatory out. It's not really the correct word. As well as their situation. And we looked at gamers and caregivers, and we looked at makers. That kind of came marketing just before the launch of the device. We would talk a lot about makers, and marketing would be like, I don't understand. I thought this was for people with disabilities. Why do you keep talking about makers? And the truth is that all the charities that we worked with, they were makers. They made things for people with disabilities. They had a lot of technical requirements. It is a common phrase that people with disabilities are the original life hackers, because they have to adapt the world to their needs. And so we wanted to create a device that made that easy. And so that's actually why we called it the adaptive controller. We didn't want you to adapt to this device. We wanted this device to adapt to you. And so really early on the engineering process, we had engineers that they couldn't they had a hard time wrapping their heads around what we were proposing with this device. And we still have that problem today, to be honest, because a lot of times people want to know, well, what's the primary use of this device? What's the golden path? What's the like main story of this device? And what we had to tell our engineers was that the main story of game controls is this guy, is our traditional controller. The adaptive controller is all the alternate stories. This is the thing that we use to fill in everybody who can't use this, right? So there isn't one case, right? There's a bunch of cases. And once we kind of wrapped our heads around that, it became a lot easier to move forward. So I want to kind of share some other lessons that I've learned over the years of practicing inclusive design at Microsoft around these principles. So the first one was recognize exclusion. It's important to recognize that everyone has biases. We all have biases. Everyone has biases. Sometimes it's called life experience, right? We all have our own point of view. And it's important to not let your assumptions or your comfort, I put comfort in quotes, get the best of you. I work with a lot of engineers who are very used to knowing, engineers and designers who are trained to know what is best, right? You know, we go through schooling, we have experience, we do all this stuff to know the answer. And the thing is when you're working with people with disabilities, it's better to go into a situation where you don't assume you know the answer at all, where you learn from the people that you work with and you recognize that your personal experiences might not apply here. And in some ways, your personal experiences can actually taint the results that you're trying to do. And that's a really hard thing to do. It's not easy. I don't want to tell people that it's so easy. I honestly think that we often tell each other to get over our biases like it is easy. And I just want to, let people know that it isn't. And it's hard work. It's 1/3 of our design process is basically understanding that. So learn from diversity. So to kind of add on to that whole, so what I just said about, comfort and learning, what I've seen happen also is that when someone who wants to do the right thing, they're open to understanding that their point of view is not necessarily universal. What they'll do is they'll meet someone with disabilities. That person will tell them what they think they should do. And this veteran designer or engineer will go away and do exactly what that person says. And that is also problematic, because if you think about our profession and you think about how we synthesize ideas and we create solutions from those ideas, we don't just take one person's opinion. So it's really important to listen to get multiple people's thoughts. And you might think you're doing the right thing because your friend who has a disability is very convincing. And I'm not saying that what they're saying is wrong. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying that we have to listen to more people. It's not just one person. And the way that I recommend that people do that is to participate in the disability community. And that can be really hard for some people. They might not have the time, they might, for me, like I participate in these communities. So I don't need to do a lot of the notion of traditional research for me is very different. So yeah, that's that one, from learn from diversity. So this last one, solve for one, extend to many. Another kind of aspect of this is, when I said that, don't do what one person says, this kind of adds on to it, is that we collaborate with the disability community, we design with them, not for them, but the collaboration is for identifying unmet needs. And we shouldn't put the burden of responsibility on coming up with the design solution squarely on the community shoulders. We're professionals too. So while I did say that, like in the beginning, we want to know the answers. At the end here, you have to understand that, yes, the community will tell you what they need, but that doesn't mean they need to tell you what to do. So I really do think that it's important to not put the burden of articulating the solutions on the disability community. And one reason for this is quite often when I work with people with disabilities, what they say they want is a better accommodation. And what I mean by that is, they'll say things like, well, let me give you an example of audio description. I worked with a blind advocate who basically said, this is what I need in audio description. And all that information that they gave us was completely valid. But it never entered their mind that we could design something so that audio description wasn't needed. There was always this idea of, well, you're going to make this regular video movie thing, interactive piece, and then I need it to be described because I'm blind, I can't see what people see. But there was never this notion of, well, what if we redesigned it so that we included you from the beginning so you didn't need this accommodation? And that can be a bit lofty, but that's, what we're trying to do is, as designers and engineers, we're trying to innovate. We're not just trying to accommodate. And, that is a bit lofty. I think the reality is that we all work at different spectrums of this, and quite often I'm, working very hard just to get basic accommodations. But, I don't want to be in a place where we're not ever thinking about innovation. So sorry, that was a bit long, but that's what I've learned over the years of doing this stuff. So I want to show you some design stories about the development of the adaptive controller. You can see these sketches here. These are from the industrial designer of the device, Chris Kajowski. He did these sketches, and these are some of his early designs of the adaptive controller. That first one at the top has the buttons in between the two, the D-pad and the system buttons in between the two big buttons. If you think about our regular controller symmetry, this makes sense. But we were worried that as you moved between the two buttons, you'd accidentally activate those ones in the middle, and some of them can be quite destructive to your game. So if you hit the Xbox button accidentally, it's not good for your games. And then the bottom one, we moved them off to the side. We moved them off to the right side. That's not where they ended up. This design, early on, we really thought of this device as very as square. We wanted it to have sharp edges because we wanted it to feel premium like our Xbox consoles, and we wanted it to have this familiarity with our Xbox design language, and that language was crisp, right? So we would talk to occupational therapists with the charities that we partnered with, and they would tell us, listen, if someone's resting their hand on a sharp edge all day, they're gonna get hurt. So you really need to slant this, and that was wonderful insight from them that we desperately needed. And, we slanted the device as much as we could to sort of accommodate that. This is a PolyJet that's pretty much the final layout of the device, what ended up being the final layout of the device. I think at this point in the process, what we were learning was that while you wanted to have the buttons close enough so that you could hit them without having a large range of motion, you also needed to have space between them so that you could do things like maybe rest your hand between the buttons so that you had places to put your parts of your body where you weren't pressing a button. And so that was really important to us. It was something that was powerful that we learned. This is a photo from Craig Hospital. When we took this photo, this was like back in 2016. Craig Hospital was actually a fairly new facility. It still is, still newish as hospitals go. But we walked around and we kept seeing all these scratches in the walls and in the elevators. And all the people that worked there didn't really notice them. They were oblivious to them. And we kept asking, well, why is everything so scratched up? Like, this place is brand new. And the reason is that, when you come to Craig Hospital, you've been injured. You've likely had a spinal cord injury. And you're learning to basically operate a wheelchair, typically a power wheelchair, for the first time. And so as people learn to drive these power chairs, they'd hit things, right? They'd hit walls and scratch, things. So it was that was an important insight for us, because we wanted to make this device mountable for people. So we have these mounting ports on the bottom of the device, and we were just going to do the standard tripod mount until we saw what we saw at Craig there. And it basically gave us this insight, gave the research team that went and visited Craig this insight that said, hey, we got to make this a heck of a lot stronger. You know, we have to make this, so we reinforced the mount and the plastic that were around it. And we put in another mounting pattern, the AMPS mounting pattern, just because that was something that was used with like more industrial strength mounting. So we wanted to make sure that you could put this device somewhere where you could, you know, where it could take a hit. The research that we did was adopted by our packaging team, and the packaging team did an amazing job in creating a package that basically embraced all the ideals that we had with the adaptive controller. And this was the start of a journey for our packaging team, and they've taken what they've learned from the adaptive controller and they've tried it on devices like our Surface computer and things like that, and we are kind of constantly learning how we develop packaging. I'm actually going to go back and play this video again, and I'll take you through what it does. So that tape loop has got a hole in it. You can put one finger in it. You can pull open the tape loop. The mailer falls apart. There's another tape loop. You could put one finger in. You'll pull open. You'll get another loop, which you can jimmy open the box with. The adaptive controller is just sitting there. It is on a card that also has a loop. You can slide that out on top of the card, and underneath it is the USB cord, which there are no ties. It is just in that cardboard container. You can shake it out, and the tray that the adaptive controller sits on is the quick start guide. So that was you know, what the packaging team did there. It's wonderful work. They did an amazing job. Okay, that I should have like an ending slide. That's what I've got, and I'd love to take some questions.
Thank you so much, Bryce. My name is Elizabeth Arredon. I'm the recruiter responsible for Latin America, and I'm going to be the moderator today. Thank you to my partners who have been responding to questions in the chat and also pre-selecting some wonderful questions from the audience. So I want to start by clarifying question from one of our attendees, just to make sure I'm understanding. There are different adds-on to the adaptive controller. Is that right?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So the most important part of the adaptive controller, and I had one slide of it, is actually the back here. So each one of these ports, you can plug what they call a standard switch interface into, which for every aspect of function on the typical controller. There's also two USB ports, one on each side, and that's for thumbsticks, but there's also actually ways to do thumbsticks back here too. It depends on the tech you want to use. So there's 17 buttons on a regular Xbox controller that are used for games. There are 19 buttons on the back of here. So we've got all 17 plus 2 extras, 2 wildcards. And so what you do is, let me see if I have there's a joystick. So this is one of the joysticks that we have. This one is lightweight, and you'd hold it in your hand and it plugs into the USB, and it also will take those buttons. So that's one joystick. This is another joystick that is quite often used by people who are quadriplegic, who don't have a lot of finger movement. So when you're quadriplegic, I mentioned Jesse and said he can't use his hands. He's what they call a high quad. So if you've got lower, if you're a lower quadriplegic, like maybe C6 or lower, C6 might even be too high. You might have some hand movement. So, but you might not have finger movement. So this type of joystick is good because you can basically move it around without having to grip it. And the way that it's been designed is there's a little button on here that you'd hit with your hand. Now that button is what they call a standard switch, and it basically uses a 3.5mm port. And so you take that standard switch and you'd plug it in there. And now that button is the A button on the controller. And when I talked about thinking about the needs of caregivers, what we saw a lot with assistive technology was that it made you learn software. It made you learn how to configure this device. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to create an experience for people where you could use this device without having to configure it. Now, it has powerful software remapping that make it even stronger, but we really wanted people to be able to use it without remapping. And so that's why there's so many ports on the back. We don't expect people to use 19 ports, but we have 19 ports because if I want to unplug this button from here and put it into there, I'm done. I don't need to do software remapping. We wanted to have that tactile kind of way for people to do it really quickly. And we've gotten a lot of really good feedback from therapists who are just trying to get a setup together really quickly. It helps them that they don't have to go into configuration software to do it. I hope that answers that question.
Thank you, Bryce. We have two questions that are very similar. How do you design for everyone if their disabilities are so different and diverse? How do you think about inclusion for all when designing? For example, when amputees that have varying amputee lengths?
Yeah, no, so that's a really good question. And I will say that I don't have a silver bullet. And so what I mean by that is when we talk about our Microsoft inclusive design methodology, we say a lot of things like we're striving to design for one size fits one, not one size fits all. So we're not trying to create one thing that works exactly the same way for everybody, because we know that people are so different. The adaptive controller doesn't come with a lot of peripherals because it would just add cost to the device, and we'd be putting accessories in the device that some people wouldn't use, that some may, but some wouldn't, and we'd just be adding cost. So it was important for us to kind of put out this bare minimum device at the cheapest price point we could, and let the community basically kind of go from there. I will say with hardware, it is a lot more tricky than software. If you're a software designer, you know, accessibility and inclusive design in many ways is just personalization to the nth degree. It's looking at wider spectrums of use, right? If I can adjust my font sizes, you know, a couple percentage points, just as a preference, I should be able to adjust it by 200% as a need as someone who might like be partially sighted. But when it comes to hardware, we know that, you know, I always have to tell my software counterparts that atoms aren't bits. You know, hardware has real world things. There is definitely an old saying in software development that if a software engineer tells you something's impossible, what they're really telling you is they don't have enough time, because nothing's really impossible with software. But hardware, you know, we have physics, right? Like we actually have like the real world. And so some things can be. So what we strive to do in our hardware teams, and I think, you know, we're just starting this journey. We actually have a long way to go, is I'm not trying to make every surface for everybody. I'm trying to make a surface that's right for you, right? We're trying to give people options in the computers and the devices and the peripherals that they use and the accessories, so that they can basically build a computer setup that works right for them. So that's how we're approaching that. I hope that answers that question.
Yes, and you touched a little bit on the on how the financials are important when designing a device. There is a question around on how do we as a company make this financially accessible for our users?
Yeah, so we definitely had a target in mind, but we also definitely had a vision of what we wanted to produce. We had no idea there was going to be a Super Bowl ad when we created this thing. We had no idea that it would generate the excitement that it has generated. We wanted to create something that solved a need that we identified. And we also thought, you know, what if this was the only the only shot that we get to do it. And so we balanced many things, but paramount to all of that is one of the big things was cost. And while I will completely own up to the fact that the adaptive controller costs more than a standard controller, it has actually all the functionality of the Elite 2 controller. So if you look at our scale of controllers, it's not the cheapest one, but it's not the most expensive one either. And it has all the functionality of the most expensive one. So it was important for us to balance those costs. And you know, we did our best, right? That's the approach that we took. We made some very distinct choices. We actually also had a software feature. I mentioned it in the presentation, this idea of Copilot, where you can sync two controllers together. And the thing is that if you were limb different and you had like one hand, we didn't want you to have to rebuy all the stuff if you could use half a controller. Like your Xbox is going to come with a controller. If you can use half of it, we want you to use it. And we want the adaptive controller to fill out the movement in other spaces. So we often get people who come to us who say things like, well, I need a one-handed controller because I only have one hand. And part of the journey that we have with these folks is basically going, stop telling me what you don't have and tell me what you do have, right? Stop telling me what you're missing. So can you use your feet? Can you use your head? Can you use your arms? We've attached buttons to people's eyebrows so that if they lift their eyebrows, it'll fire a button. And you know, there's actually lots of other cool things that people have done because the adaptive controller is so intentionally simple. You know, there's lots of great hacks out there in the world where people have put together things that will let you fire it off really simply. So that's how we approached cost. The program team changed what our definition of success was to actually do it. You know, so while I don't want to say that, you know, the finances of the program aren't important, we want to be, we're a responsible company. We're not irresponsible, but we definitely knew that this was something that we had to do to kind of meet our obligations and of what we consider our vision. And so, you know, we made it. The business team made exceptions, and we got the device made.
Wonderful. Students are interested in learning what was the biggest challenge your team faced when designing the adaptive controller.
Yeah, there's so many. I think, and it's funny, you know, because I feel like I learned a million lessons, and even I relearn those lessons like all the time. So not only as a company are we relearning lessons, but like I mean, the inventors of the adaptive controller, I was on the original hack team. I've been on the whole journey. I worked with all the charities, and I think that idea of modularity and and how people can combine things together is what I would say is probably the most intriguing. And I don't want to, and you know what, I think we learned a lot on developing the device itself, but we definitely have learned a lot since the device has been out in the world. I think one of the things that is very, you know, it's something that we still have a lot of work to do and a lot of to get people, is that people are very used to basically going out and going, well, I need a thing, I'm going to go buy this thing, and then I'm going to use this thing. And with the adaptive controller, it's basically like a kit, right? You know, we basically like show up and go, hey, this, you know, there are things that are in here that will help you design what you need. And so for me, I think I learned this lesson when it came out, and I still learn it every day, is that I think I assumed that people would know what they need, that people would instinctively know what they need more than they do. And that's where we learn the lesson of people basically saying, well, I can only do this. That's basically the one-handed thing. Like when someone shows up and they only have one hand, they go, I need a one-handed controller. and you start asking them, well, why not feet or your, head or other things? They just never thought of it before, because gaming is this is so intuned in people's brains that this is how you game, that if you only have one hand, that this is all you get, as opposed to, you have the rest of your body. And that's something that I think we still need to kind of work with and work on, is that idea of how we think about computing and input. That's basically what my whole day is about all the time.
And there is another question on how do you capture the user needs of disabilities around the world?
Yeah, I saw that one come in really early, and I like that question. And I will definitely say that with the adaptive controller, when we were developing it, we were very US, UK centric, because we had to be. That was who our partners were. That's what we knew. And since then, we've tried to engage in new markets. We've tried to engage with new folks. I'm excited that I finally have some contacts and some prospects to learn from people in like Brazil and South America. We are starting to do more research in China. And I think the barriers, I don't want to say the barriers are universal, because I think when it comes to disability, what's been really interesting to kind of uncover is the cultural attitudes around how you approach the problem. I think in North America, we're at a place where the social model of disability makes sense, where it's basically like, well, of course it's how the system is designed and not how and if you look at beyond disability systems, if you look at systematic institutions in general, I think as a society, we're coming around to this idea that, hey, maybe the system is designed wrong, and that the design of the system is actually what's causing the barriers across multitudes of marginalization. But I will say that I don't know if that attitude is culturally universal yet. And I know that around the world, people want to care for the people. People want the people that they care for to have rich lives. That's what I know. That's done is dependent on culture. Some cultures think that it's not society's challenge, it's a family challenge. And that's fine. I mean, I think either way, when we develop products that help address it, we're helping society and we're helping families. And, I think that's what we're learning. But yeah, I definitely own up to the fact that I think we started in North America and branched out. We need to branch out more.
Thank you, Bryce. We have a couple of more questions, so I would love to cover as much as we can. Yeah. There is a very unique question. Do you have any insights on how machine learning and AI can play a role for inclusive design?
Yeah, I mean, we have a program at Microsoft called AI for Accessibility. It's a grant program where we're encouraging startups and people who work in artificial intelligence to apply for grants, and we'll that focus on accessibility, and we'll work through that. Some of our biggest accessibility wins are actually powered by AI and our cognitive services. If any of you have an iPhone, we have an app on the iPhone called Seeing AI, which is an app for people who are blind to basically use the camera of the iPhone to describe the world for them. So if people who are blind can go into a restaurant, they can hold up the paper menu, they can point their camera phone at it, and the phone will read the menu to them. That's one example that uses our cognitive services and OCR basically to do that. But beyond that, it'll also say, you can point it at a person and go, this person is like, 30 years old, or, female, other attributes of them. Like we can use our cognitive services to describe the world in ways that blind people need. And so that's one real powerful sort of example of our AI capabilities. And there's a bunch of others. Does that answer that question, I think?
hopefully, we can get more feedback from the chat. We have a question about just financials and profitability. So one size fits one device and financially accessible devices seem contradictory. How do you trade off to achieve the balance point? From the aspect of business operation, how do you maintain profitability?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And for us at Microsoft, I'll be frank, there's a bunch of answers that we have to think about. So, I definitely work in the disability community where people with disabilities feel like that this device, since it costs more than a regular controller, is an exclusion, and that is fair criticism. The reality is this device costs way more than a regular controller to build, and plus, we make millions of these. We don't make millions of the adaptive controller. So there's different types of scale there. I've also heard feedback from the community that says, the peripherals, when this device came out, the peripherals that you could plug into it were actually pretty expensive. And it's because they were made by medical companies for very specific needs. So they had a medical premium on them. Now, at the same time, if you wanted to make your own buttons, you can go to any kind of surplus store and buy buttons. And if you knew how to wire them up, it's actually fairly simple. I've shown people how to do it a bunch of times, and I am nowhere near an electrical engineer. One example is that we actually had someone from Logitech, when they first saw the device, what they did was they plugged in their earbuds into one of the ports, and they hit the volume up button, and it actually fired the button, which is interesting because that doesn't work on every pair of earbuds, but it happened to work on theirs, which is really kind of cool how that one worked. So sorry, I do want to get into this more. So it is a balance, right? We always are balancing function and value and price. And for us, we've gotten criticism that basically said, hey, Microsoft could produce $5 buttons, that plug into this thing. And I mean, $5 is probably, it's not wrong, but the challenge is for us is I don't think that as a company we can make hardware that's in that price range. That's not our role. That's not our area. So it's very important for us to partner with other companies. So I mentioned Logitech. Logitech makes a great set of buttons for the adaptive controller at the most reasonable price out there in the market, because they identified, working with us and talking with people with disabilities, they identified the need to have buttons at a better price, and they wanted to do something for this community. So Logitech stepped up, and they put out their own version of buttons, which are very reasonable. So we need to continue to develop those relationships with other consumer electronics companies. And I don't want us to. We will try to influence them as best as we can. We don't really like telling our partners what to do, but we can be strong. We can say that this is really important to us. This is part of our mission, and we think you should get on board. So that's what we try to do.
Thank you, Bryce. And we have a final question. When it comes to inclusion, how do you foster an environment where people who come from different backgrounds know you value their ideas?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I will admit that I've been so focused on product development, it's tricky to. I've also been at Microsoft a really long time, and so what I mean by that is I remember the old Microsoft where, where fostering ideas wasn't valued. Let me put it that way. And we've changed a lot, and it's not a quick change. And I think that that's because, people exist that were in the old world, and they learned bad habits, myself included. There's lots of bad habits that I had to unlearn. to make sure that we create this environment that we all kind of want to be a part of. And I think, you know, I by no means want to say that we're perfect, but I will definitely say that we're on the right direction and that we work very, very hard. It is part of all of our the goals that we're that we all have universally across the company are that we have for our annual reviews. There is an inclusiveness goal in there that basically says, what are you doing to include people? So we like this word intentional a lot. So we're really trying to be intentional. Like, it's not enough that you're not a jerk. You have to actively be, you know, someone that is working towards inclusion. Like, not being a jerk is not enough, right? And so that is how, as a company, we're addressing it. But you know, there's lots of great programs that do it. And I'm very thankful for all of them. Yeah.
Thank you, Bryce. And I must say that we received very positive feedback on the chat. Congratulations for the hard work. Thank you for the effort that you do and the difference that you make in the world. So I just want to thank you for your time today. One of my most cherished memories as a recruiter is a trip that I did with Dave McCarty, who is a high-rank executive in Xbox, who is responsible for inclusion. Yeah, and we visited a facility in Chile who is devoted to provide physical therapy for people with disabilities, and we tried the adaptive controller, and then a few months later it was launched in Chile. So awesome. A very, very nice experience, and I'm very, very excited to learn more about the efforts that are happening in South America. So thank you for your time and being with us and sharing this. The students and the audience were very, very engaged. So happy Tuesday, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.